What's going on, everybody? Kalip's Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, we're going to revisit the Motorola Moto G Stylus LTE 2022 and go over whether or not it's still a good phone to buy in late 2022. Now, of course, being released in February of 2022, this phone is still relatively new, but at this point at the end of the year, there are definitely several other options out there. So we're going to be going over its specs and features to help you decide whether or not it's still a good option for you. Now, before we go any further, as always, I do want to remind you to hit that subscribe button, and if you want to learn more about this phone, I will be linking to several other videos about it in the description, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But with that being said, let's get into it. So with the Motorola Moto G Stylus LTE 2022, we're getting a 6.8-inch 90Hz IPS LCD display with a resolution of 1080p, a PPI of 396, an aspect ratio of 20.5:9, and an 84.6% screen-to-body ratio. So for what it is, this phone really does have a great display. At 6.8 inches, this phone is definitely on the larger side, so if you're consuming a lot of content, this is going to be a great thing for you. With an aspect ratio of 20.5:9, we're getting a really tall and narrow form factor here. So if you're doing something like streaming videos in landscape mode, for example, you're going to get a more immersive experience. And if you're doing something like browsing the web, using social media, stuff like that, with this kind of form factor, you can fit more content on the screen without having to scroll as much. Aside from the size and dimensions, with again a 1080p resolution, we got a real nice sharp image here. The colors look great, the brightness is pretty good for what it is, and with a 90Hz refresh rate, the movement on the screen is going to be a little bit faster and smoother than usual, and this is going to make the phone feel a little bit more premium to use. So in general, if you're looking for a phone with a good display, for what it is, the Moto G Stylus LTE is really going to be a great choice. Now this phone is getting 128GB of internal storage with microSD card expansion, so definitely a great amount of storage here. On one hand, if you're really a heavy user and you're constantly downloading apps, especially stuff like games that tend to take up a bit more space, then in that case you might want to get a higher end device that has even more storage. But for the average user, I do feel like 128 is going to be perfectly fine, especially considering this phone does have microSD card expansion. So if you have a lot of photos and videos, for example, you can always offload that stuff onto a microSD card, and this is going to give you even more space. For security features, this phone does have Face Unlock and a fingerprint scanner right here on the power key. Definitely a great spot for a fingerprint scanner, but let's go ahead and give it a try. There we go, one more time. And there we go. So as you can see, real fast and responsive, no issues at all. And again, remember, this phone does have Face Unlock too, so if you want to use that instead, you always can. Now taking a look at the camera setup here, we got a real nice looking hole punch design for the front facing camera. This camera is 16 megapixels. Then on the back, we got a triple camera setup with a 50 megapixel main camera, an 8 megapixel ultra wide camera that also doubles as a macro camera. Definitely a unique design, you don't see that every day. And also a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera. So in general, as far as features go, the Moto G Stylus really has everything. So if you're taking a lot of pictures and you want a wider variety of features, this phone is definitely going to be a great option. And in addition to just having the features, the photo quality itself is really good as well. Sure, on one hand, it's not going to be nearly as good as a higher end phone, but for the average user, for stuff like social media, for example, the quality you get with this phone is going to be perfectly fine. For video, this phone has a max recording quality of 1080p in both the rear and front cameras, so no 4K unfortunately, but in this price range, it's really not surprising. As far as RAM and processor go, the Moto G Stylus is getting 6GB of RAM with the MediaTek Dimensity G88 processor. Now keep in mind, this is not the Moto G Stylus 5G. This phone in my hand is LTE only. The Moto G Stylus 5G is actually a completely separate phone, so definitely keep that in mind. That being said, the performance on this phone is pretty decent. I mean, if you're really going to be using your phone all the time, then you might want to go for something a little bit higher end that has a faster processor. But for honestly more of an entry-level 5G phone, I do think this phone has pretty decent performance. For basic activities like web browsing, social media, stuff like that, it will absolutely get the job done. So honestly, just considering what this phone is actually meant for, I don't really have any complaints. Now that being said, I did run a Geekbench 5 benchmark test on this phone, and here are the scores I got. What I recommend doing is running this test on your current phone and comparing your results to these, and that's going to give you a better idea of whether or not this phone is going to be a performance upgrade for you. But in general with this phone, I feel like performance isn't really its strong point. Sure, it's not bad, but if you really want a 4G phone that has great performance, at this point at the end of 2022, the Samsung Galaxy A23 LTE is out, and that phone has much better performance. But then again, honestly, if you really want a phone with great performance, you're probably going to end up with a 5G phone anyway. So if you're just really doing basic activities, you don't care about 5G connectivity, and you really just don't need anything fancy, I do feel like this phone is going to be perfectly fine. Now for the battery, the Moto G Stylus LTE has a 5000 mAh battery that supports 10W fast charging, so definitely a good battery here. With a 5000 mAh battery, that's pretty much the largest battery you can get in a smartphone, at least in the US. So if you're looking for something that has great battery life, you're really not going to be disappointed here. As far as the fast charging goes, on one hand, 10W fast charging is definitely not the best in the world, but that being said, in my experience, the charging speeds you get with this phone are pretty decent, so again, I really don't have any complaints. specs. As far as the software goes, this phone does currently have Android 11, and apparently it's not going to get any major updates. I heard the Moto G Stylus 5G is, but unfortunately the LTE version doesn't have the same software support, so if having the latest software is important to you, then this is probably not going to be the phone for you. As far as other features go, of course, as the name suggests, the Moto G Stylus does have a stylus. It has a nice pop-out design. And as far as the actual quality goes, I mean, it's not the best stylus in the world, but at the same time, for the more basic activities you're probably going to be doing with this phone, like taking handwritten notes, maybe playing a game or two, and just navigating in general, it does get the job done. So if you want a phone that has a stylus, and you don't want to spend $1,400 on a Samsung Galaxy S22 Ultra, then the Moto G Stylus is really one of the few options you have. Something else I do want to point out here is that unfortunately, the Moto G Stylus LTE does not have NFC, so if you like to make contactless mobile payments using Tap and Pay, definitely keep this in mind. But in conclusion, is the Motorola Moto G Stylus LTE 2022 still a good phone to buy in late 2022? In general, I personally really think it is. If you're looking for a really entry-level 4G phone for the bare minimum, stuff like web browsing, streaming content like videos and music, some light social media and stuff like that, sure, on one hand, you could get a really low-end phone for less than $100, but personally, if I were in that situation, I would honestly just get something like this, because in general, unlike a really cheap phone, the Moto G Stylus LTE, while still being pretty low-end and pretty affordable, is really built to last, and honestly, it has a bunch of nice features, like the stylus for example, a really good display, a large battery, and a great camera setup. So in general, if you are looking for a really entry-level phone, and you don't need crazy performance or anything like that, but you also want something decent that's going to be great for daily activities, I do think at this point in 2022, about 10 months after it being released, the Moto G Stylus LTE 2022 is still a great option. Now once again, if you want to learn more about this phone, I will be linking to several other videos about it in the description, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kalipus Tech on Twitter and Instagram. And as always, I will see you in the next video.